Absolutely.
So, Glenn, we're so glad you're here. You've been very busy in general, but ever since this whole conflict broke out in Ukraine with Russia invading 2 weeks ago, it has been a strange time to be in. So, my first question to you is, does something feel off about all this?
I think actually something feels familiar about it in the sense that I think traditionally, whenever the United States is in some way involved in a war, either directly or peripherally, or obviously we're somewhere in the middle here, we're supplying arms, we're clearly on one side, we're taking all kinds of steps to help one side over the other. So we're, a direct participant, even though not militarily, and hopefully it'll stay that way, but still generally this kind of jingoism arises, a kind of tribalistic sense of unity, this pride in the virtuousness of our national values. And I think for a few decades, probably beginning with the war in Vietnam, and then certainly because of the war in Iraq, the confidence that Americans had in the Pentagon and their military and their government and their intelligence community eroded significantly. And I think there was a lot of skepticism, healthy skepticism, a long overdue skepticism toward the idea that the United States should be asserting itself into every conflict and using its superior power in order to resolve it in one way or the other. And I think it's all but gone, at least for the first 3 weeks of this war. We seem to have this very revitalized sense of our own exceptionalism, the belief that this time our intelligence community got it right, the CIA is back, we're really effective in the way we're uniting NATO and isolating Russia, and we're clearly on the morally, unambiguously moral side, and that has kind of rejuvenated this nationalistic sense that often emerges, and not just from one political camp or the other, but very bipartisan. I mean, there's almost no daylight at all between the Republican and the Democratic parties and the corporate media. And so I guess I would more describe that as familiar than off, but in some sense, we haven't really seen it since probably September 11th. And so maybe in that sense, it is a little off, that it's kind of this old familiar feeling that we thankfully hadn't seen for a while until this month.
Jay?
Right. I mean, and we see like the typical players like
Hey, Jay, what's
Lindsey
your Twitter name again? Sorry, I forgot. I wanted to note that down.
It's at Asliken, ASSLIKEN.
All right, thank you. Good. I have it.
You're welcome. It's the 14th one, so I was getting creative with a handle, and I think that one stuck really well.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. But what I was bringing up was the familiarity that I find in it is the same people like the Lindsey Grahams, the Adam Lickfingers. Yeah, Kinzinger. Thank you. I call him Adam Lickfingers. And how they are calling for actual boots on the ground. They're calling to escalate this even more, to put the nail in Putin's coffin and everything. And is it because they are so intertwined with the military industrial complex, or is it because they have this fake sense of patriotism?
I think people are just getting carried away with this intense emotional.
Did we lose Glenn?
And I tried to kind of grapple with this before, obviously, and I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You basically cut out at the very beginning of your answer.
Yeah. So can you hear me now? Is everything okay?
Yeah, we're
now?
good. We're good.
Yeah, we're good
now.
Okay. So what I was saying was, I think that what's really going on is that people are getting very carried away by this intense emotionalism that this war, in my view, uniquely is fostering. And I've tried to grapple with this, understanding why. Obviously, the days and the weeks after the 9/11 attack was also a time of extraordinary unity, but also great emotion. There was a lot of anger and rage at the people who attacked the United States. Rightfully so. I mean, that was a morally atrocious attack, and there was this kind of joint nationalistic purpose in making the people who did it pay and preventing another attack. But I actually think that in some ways, even as kind of emotionally turbulent and traumatizing as that moment was, and as intolerant to dissent as it was, it was in a little bit of I think you can really make the case that it was actually more rational and more sober, especially once a few days elapsed where there were people starting to question whether the Patriot Act was a good idea, whether the war in Afghanistan made sense. Obviously, as we built up to the war in Iraq, there was a fair amount of dissent that flourished. And I think that the difference here, I mean, it shouldn't even be comparable to 9/11 because in this case, the huge difference is our country has not been attacked at all. No one's threatening to attack our country.
Yeah, and plus January 6th was 69 times worse than 9/11. We all know this, right?
Yeah, and Pearl Harbor and the Holocaust combined. So
Exactly.
obviously January 6th is nothing should ever be compared to that most sacred day of January 6th. But leaving that aside, I think the big difference is social media. I think the fact that people are just glued to their computer screens, and then of course cable also plays a big role, but social media in particular, where everything is curated. If anyone is raising doubts or dissent or questioning that's bothering you, you can just with a button make
Spencer, you're fired.
Remarkable, and I'd say incomparable instrument of kind of groupthink and dissent intolerance, and in a lot of ways having people, not just in the United States, but throughout the West, all feed on the same information, the same emotionality, the same messaging, the same rage constantly, day after day, hour after hour. I think it's producing a kind of inebriation that is even more irrational than what happened right after 9/11.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that, I mean, I guess what I'm noticing in all of this is that there has been, as you mentioned before, no daylight between the Democratic and Republican parties, as well as the corporate media, and how they're approaching the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that's somewhat startling considering the times that we're living in which basically everything has become a culture war or a partisan issue. So the idea that everyone seems to be unifying behind a particular cause, putting a lot of our differences aside, I guess is probably a bit unnerving to me. And if anything, unsettling, because again, we are so divided as a country. Why is it that we somehow unite for a country that's all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, one of the poorest nations in Europe, and basically outmanned and outgunned by the entire Russian Federation?
Yeah, it's bizarre for so many reasons. I mean, and I can think that what's important to point out is this lockstep unity is not just on the very narrow moral question of whether Russia's invasion is unjustifiable or whether Putin is bad, right? That's like a very narrow proposition that I can understand people more or less agreeing to. Is there's only one country getting bombed and whose civilians are being killed, and that's Ukraine. And it doesn't surprise me that we're kind of looking at that and seeing the images every day and empathizing with the country that's being, targeted by a much more powerful military with bombardment and shelling and all kinds of horrific scenes. It goes way beyond that. It's not that moral consensus is then transmitting into these policy realms of, well, what should the United States do about it? Should we just, kind of keep our distance on the ground that it's not worth risking, like a nuclear war for defense of Ukraine? Should we really be collapsing the Russian economy? Isn't that kind of in some way unjust to make Russian civilians suffer, given our view that Russia is not a democracy and chose its government, but instead is this like despotic, totalitarian dictatorship, as the mainstream saying goes? And isn't it kind of risky as well to collapse the economy of a country that has more nuclear warheads than any other on the planet, including the United States? What about the ongoing role of NATO, which is supposed to be this defensive alliance that suddenly now is very involved in defense of a country that's not a member of that alliance? And what about the risk there? None of these questions are permissible because they all seem as though we're, by raising them, siding with the Russians, to say nothing of things like, what about all these weapons that are being flooded into Ukraine? Like, we should have learned our lesson, I would have thought, in Afghanistan and Syria, where we did the same things to prolong wars, to turn it into this grueling insurgency. And those weapons fell into the hands of all kinds of people we say we wouldn't want to have armed, and that created all kinds of blowback for many years to come. Who are getting these weapons in Ukraine? My guess is there are a fair amount going to the most extremist factions. That's who always ends up doing the hardest core and most aggressive fighting, and that the nation kind of rallies behind. That's what happened in Syria. That's obviously what's happening here. I'm sure there's neo-Nazi battalions getting very sophisticated weaponry that they're going to have for a long time to come. So the problem is not that everyone's in agreement that the invasion was wrong and Putin is bad. The problem is that is then generating consensus on almost every policy issue that follows. And whereas 3 weeks ago, it was totally taboo to bring up the idea that we should have a no-fly zone because it's insane, because we would be clearly risking a nuclear exchange by doing that. Although it's still a minority of people who advocated, although the Western leaders are still pretty steadfast in saying they don't want to do it, every day that goes by, more and more people in the mainstream are standing up and advocating either that or something very similar, like sending fighter jets or other kinds of things that have long been considered acts of war. And I feel like we're not moving away from this hysteria, but we're immersing ourselves in it more and more as each day goes by. And I'm concerned where that's going to take us.
Right.
Jay?
And what you pointed to earlier as well is like social media, and they're showing us every single day trying to get this sympathetic reaction out of people so they can also back the war itself. And the more that we see these things, the more they're trying to play on the sympathetic strings of the public. And it's really funny because, like you were saying, we had David, what's his name? David Foom, and then Joy Reid, both from talk about how either you're behind this presidency or you're with Putin. Like those are the only two options you get. And both of these guys are supposedly like on different ends of the political spectrum, saying the same message to everybody. And it's just weird to see this happening.
You know, one of the things I realized during Russiagate, I remember the first time Russiagate emerged as a campaign theme. It was this dark, sinister, innuendo-laden campaign ad from the Clinton campaign, basically with dark music and all kinds of, deep voices raising questions about what's really going on between Donald Trump and the Kremlin. What's their relationship?
Is Glenn Greenwald really a Russian asset?
Exactly. Like flash my phone, my face on for like a second subliminally. I remember being surprised that more people didn't recoil from that, because one of the things that my politics and my ethos is based in is one of the worst civil liberties crises of the last half of the 20th century, which is the McCarthy era. So when people start invoking that theme almost verbatim, like who is a clandestine agent of the Kremlin and who is Russia secretly controlling and who has misplaced loyalties to the United States, I just have an instinctive aversion to it. And one of the things that I realized as I saw that way fewer people than I expected to have that similar reaction did was that one of the reasons history repeats itself is because every generation that's emerges into adulthood didn't actually live through it, and therefore don't know about it. They either only know it from a kind of clinical distance, having not lived through it, or they don't know about it at all. And so what is again surprising to me about this framework of you're either on the side of the president of the United States or you're with the Russians is that was exactly the binary framework imposed by George Bush and Dick Cheney in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack. And it was David Frum, as a Bush White House speechwriter, who wrote those early speeches by George Bush, disseminating that logic. Bush on September 20th, 9 days after the 9/11 attack, went before a joint session of Congress and notoriously pronounced, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And so to watch the very same people 20 years later, Bill Kristol and David Frum and Nicole Wallace and Matthew Dowd and all these people who worked inside the Bush White House and the Bush-Cheney orbit, disseminating exactly the same theme and being applauded by liberals who had been the target of that is, in the first instance, kind of shocking until you realize that you're talking about millions of people again who didn't live through that, who don't know who David Frum is except his nice, good anti-Trump incarnation since 2016. Right. And I think like it has produced this perfect storm of Democrats who have been feeding on hatred for Russia since 2016, when they were told that it was the fault of Putin that Hillary's coronation didn't happen and Donald Trump was elected. So they've been been fed conspiracy theories about Russia for years. The Russians have taken over the United States through blackmail control of Trump, the PP tape, all of that, the Steele dossier. They've been being trained and accustomed to view Russia as this grave enemy of the United States for many years now in a way that was predictably dangerous. And then on the right, you always have this kind of latent lurking militarism. It's like a kind of tough guy mentality. The right, before Trump, was almost entirely driven by this idea that when there's war, we go and we kick ass and show everyone who's boss. Trump created a pretty non-trivial segment on the right that is now much more questioning of American militarism. That's one of the, in my view, most valuable things he did. So there is a non-trivial segment on the right and on the left that's dissenting, but still the right, more or less like the kind of Mitt Romneys and Lindsey Graham's and Marco Rubio's, those types. Soon as a war breaks out, they're right back to this kind of like, yeah, we're the superpower, we're exceptional, we're the indispensable country, as Joe Scarborough said, and we're going to go kick ass. And I think this kind of dual track motivation for Democrats and Republicans has created this really disturbing unity, again, not just on the question of the moral issue, but on the policy issues as well.